Good evening. On behalf of the Department of Art, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture with artist Alan Rath. Alan's visit is part of the Critic and Artist Residency series, a program that brings important critics, curators, and artists to campus for lectures and work with students in the community. His work is on view at the Hatton Gallery through April 29th. Alan Rath's visit is made possible by the fund at CSU. Additional funding for this program has been provided by the Colorado Council on the Arts and the Department of Mechanical Engineering's Robotics Lab. We are very grateful to all of our sponsors for helping to make this program a reality. I'm absolutely delighted this evening to introduce visiting artist Alan Rath. I have been an admirer of Rath's work for a number of years, ever since I saw his piece in the permanent collection of the Denver Art Museum. Rath is an MIT-trained engineer who makes sculpture where technology is both the subject and medium of the work. At MIT, Rath studied electrical engineering and later experimented with aesthetics at MIT's Visual Language Workshop and MIT's Center for Advanced Visual Studies. Subsequently, he has received widespread acknowledgement of his innovative contributions to contemporary sculpture that is keyed to a scientific perspective. Rath is committed to experimentation with various forms of new media, as you'll see tonight, including LEDs, cathode ray tubes, LCDs, and robotics. John Hanhart, in an essay commissioned for our exhibition, has written, "With unparalleled artistry, Rath has fashioned a body of work that articulates the cognitive pulse shaping a new sense and sensibility in world culture today. This pulse is configuring the technological environment we live in and through. Rath brings substance to the shifting and expanding ground of the new media environment," end quote. Alan Rath's work has been exhibited extensively throughout the United States and abroad at numerous museums, including Site Santa Fe, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Walker Art Center, and the Institute of Contemporary Art in Taipei. Rath has also been included in many major exhibitions which have examined the merging of art and technology, including Body Mécanique at the Wexner Center and Alternating Currents, American Art in the Age of Technology at the San Jose Museum of Art. His sculpture is included in the permanent collections of many museums, including the Denver Art Museum, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. I'm really honored that Alan has joined us here at Colorado State, so without further ado, will you please join me in welcoming Alan Rath.
Thank you for that introduction. And thanks everybody for showing up tonight. It was a big auditorium. Now, I also would like to thank the university and its funders for supporting this exhibition, because it's really, it takes a lot to put on a show like this. And there are certainly a lot of people who helped on it. And I especially do want to thank Linda Frickman for all of the work she did. This project started more than a year ago, I think, and I'm sure all the shows she does, it's a very long process. You're only seeing the final end point of it, but we've been in contact for a year, working out all the details, and she has been one of the most organized people I've ever worked with, and I'm glad she never asked me the same thing twice, and I appreciate, being so on top of things, made it a lot easier for me to do, so thank you for that. This lecture, this presentation, is something that I've been trying to do many times, and each time I get a better sense of what it is I'm trying to say, and I realize that all of these ideas that I'm going to present sort of exist simultaneously in my head, and it's a real problem to convert that into a narrative where they're sequenced one after the other, because that's not really the way I see this information. For me, it all exists without an order, without a hierarchy, without a precedence, and without weighting. So it's kind of hard to put it into a narrative. So if at any point it doesn't make sense, it's not because you're having trouble understanding, it's because I'm having trouble making that narrative thread. While I was putting all this stuff together for this version, I came across this quote from Camus, which I thought was really interesting. He said, "A man's work is nothing but the slow trek to rediscover, through the detour of art, those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened." And I thought, well, that's what I'm trying to do here tonight. I want to show things that I saw when I was very young that made a huge impression on me. As you heard, I studied electrical engineering, but what I'm going back to is my childhood in the 60s. I was born in 1959, and somehow I have way too much memory of the 60s. It must be retroactive. I don't know if I really remember all this from the 60s, but it seems like it. I saw it and it made this huge impression on me. So anyway, I'm going to show all these images, talk a lot about things that I loved as a kid, and then show a video of a lot of works that aren't in the show, so you can see more of my work and hopefully have an interest to go see the stuff that actually is here. You can see it in person. And then the best part is at the end we can do a bunch of Q&A. I really do prefer that part where we can interact. So save your questions to the end, and please ask me no matter what it's about, because I'm always interested in what you guys are thinking after seeing this work. So let me see if I can start at the beginning, because in Professor Frickman's course today, I taught 500 years of art history in 20 minutes, so now I'm going to do 25,000 years in a half an hour. So your art history students, you know what this is. The Venus of Willendorf, which is about 25,000 years old. And I'm glad to see that a sculptor beat some cave painters by 12,000 years or so. This is Calder in 1929, so I have skipped some, but it's basically from a female figure to a female figure, still after 25,000 years. But I think one of the most interesting turns in art history is what happened next. Was just 2 years later, he came up with this, which is, I just think, fascinating. And this shows so much about what I'm interested in. This made with steel wire, and it's kinetic. You can see the little crank down in the corner. I think you could turn this. And the main thing, though, is that it's structural rather than being volumetric. So after all this time of shaping material and creating volumes, now here's finally a structure, which is made possible by the material, which is steel, which is strong enough to do this. And you've probably seen a lot of his work. I think some of it's really quite beautiful. And I love the nature of this wire, where the lines are not quite straight, not perfectly straight. So you have a very draftsman-like line. And this one is even motorized. So there was some motorized contraption causing this thing to move up and down, 1931. I hear that he was disappointed in the reliability of mechanical components like that, and that's how we sought out the wind solution. which was, which I think was brilliant, but he's done that. So now I get to use motors, maybe. Anyway, here's, a very classic Calder's getting more and more iconographic. And you'll see these have to work physically in terms of balance. So they actually have to obey the laws of physics. Now here by 1940, looking very classic. This is not Calder. This is a painting by my favorite sculptor, and I like him so much better as a sculptor than a painter. It's David Smith, who likewise, here in the 30s, was using the industrial material of steel and the industrial technique of welding to make sculpture. In 1937. By the 50s, he's really nailing it. Now, something that's this empty can only be done with an incredibly strong material, like steel. And here's a quote from David Smith. He said, "My reverence for iron is in function before technique. It is the cheapest metal. It conceptually is within the scale of my life. And most important, before I knew what art was, I was an ironmonger. The iron element I hold in high respect. I consider it eidetic in property. The metal particularly possesses no art craft. What it can do in arriving at form economically, no other element can do." So, yeah, I really love the part. The metal particularly possesses no art craft. Now we take it for granted. Every art department at every university has a welding studio, and everybody welds together steel. And when my parents tell people that their son is a sculptor, everybody imagines that I weld steel. As this has become completely normal, but there was a time when it was totally an industrial material and an industrial technique. But he worked in the steel yards. He worked as a welder. He knew the material and he knew the technique. Now, I was saying I didn't know exactly what got into Calder between 29 and 31, but maybe he saw this, which was by that guy Picasso, who just was so clever. So this is one of the oldest, what I think of as structural sculptures that is put together and has lots of empty space rather than being volumetric. So maybe he was cribbing from that. Which takes me to my favorite thing. The greatest art project of the 20th century, maybe of the last 500 years. I don't know if this is my bias because of when I grew up, but I think it's a great project because it did occur in the 60s, and it was a media project, and it's video art, it's installation art, it's a happening, it's site-specific in the extreme, it's environmental art. So all these things were sort of born in the 60s, and there's this art collective that put on this project, which I think was the most successful of these, and they put this thing up on the moon, which really was a coup. And This happened in 1969. Brilliant, brilliant project. Ended up putting up an entire sculptural installation up on the surface. Now, they took lots of documentation so that we know that this thing happened. And some of these photographs are just stunningly beautiful. And I think this really is the best image of man since this one. And they are amazingly similar if you look at their poses. And the other thing, David's a lot bigger than I thought. He's bigger than life size. And what's interesting is that this is the David of David and Goliath fame, and he's holding a rock. And I think that these things go together, that this image of man as being, he's naked and vulnerable, but has a rock, violent and powerful. And here we see the same image of so powerful to fly all the way to the moon, so vulnerable that a single pinprick will be the end of it. And again, I think this is such a great image of the 20th century, like Laurie Anderson said, big science, little man. It's just a compelling image. Now, a lot of people criticized the Apollo program for just being political propaganda, which it definitely was, to try to, champion the U.S. and distract us from the Vietnam War. And the astronauts were heroes who got to talk to the president. So there was that whole aspect of it. But I think it was a lot more than that. It was a Gesamtkunstwerk, and we have these three dorks who, through a radical makeover, just become these timeless heroes. I mean, this fashion, this picture is almost 40 years old. It does not look that dated, I mean, the way that does, even though these were taken the same year. So, I mean, fashion took a huge leap forward. You can see the cargo pants and the big boots. And the electronic accessories like cell phones before they ever existed. There was also all this poetry that was created. I mean, these great phrases: concentric sequence initiation maneuver, differential height and terminal phase maneuvers. And this is the way everybody was talking in the 60s when they were talking about the Apollo program. You'd hear this on the news constantly. And the TPI preceded the CDM, which came before the CSI, which led to insertion. Which is the other thing, that this was a massive, sexual play going on with the moon as the object, sort of the ultimate fertility symbol with its 29.5-day cycle, and this giant phallus of a missile going to it. So it had broad appeal. I think that's why everybody understood it. Now, it was a massive, massive project in scale, just gigantic. I mean, in size, but also just logistically. You can see this is the Saturn V rocket on the launch pad. This is the vehicle assembly building down in the swamp of Florida. You can't even see how big that is, really. This would give you a better sense of scale. You know how you're driving around the Midwest and you see one of those water towers? It's the biggest thing around, towering over the city. The biggest, you look up to it. Here we have a bird's eye view. These are cars. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories high. So this thing is just absolutely enormous. And it's on the way out on this track to the launch pad here. Here you could see the barge, how the barge, most of the components that went into this thing were too big to transport any other way but by barge, and so they would arrive at the vehicle assembly building by barge and be unloaded and go in there. This is all happening in the 60s. I thought it was a project on par with this one, which was another clever art project. Scale, yeah, size does matter. And also, this thing has lasted for thousands of years. You know, this thing ends up, size-wise, being a lot smaller up on the moon. But there's a plaque on the leg of the lunar lander. This is the stairs coming down, and it says blah, 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 something. But it says, "We came in peace for all mankind." And so, you know, you wonder, why did we have to go to all the trouble to put a sculpture on the moon? And I think the subtext of this problem of this project, has to do with the situation in the 60s, in the Cold War, and the culture thinking that, well, we're going to wipe ourselves off the surface of the Earth. So for there to be any record of our existence, we need to put it someplace safe. Putting it up on the moon was just great because it's, you know, there's no atmosphere, no plants, it's not going to rust. It's going to stay there for thousands of years. So here is the giant missile on the launch pad. Now, it was also like a religious icon here, lit, you know, flood lit through the night, you know, like a flag or a cross, or you keep the light on it all night long before the launch. Like I say, the concept, everybody knew, this was high concept art. Everybody has seen the moon. Everybody on Earth has seen the moon and can understand the concept. You know, it doesn't have to be very, very complicated. We're going to go from here and walk around up there. So blast off, and there we are. This is like the most American image possible of the car parked out in front of the house. But besides that, it gave us some new, besides the classic old images that were updated, it gave us new images that we had never seen before. Like this is Earthrise, which you can see from the surface of the moon or from orbit. And what's funny is that even in the dictionary, it says this word comes from 1968, which came from the Apollo program prior to landing on the moon, where they were in orbit around the moon and saw this happen. And so it's just really funny to me to think that this phenomenon that's been going on for millions of years never got a name until a human saw it, even though everybody knew it was happening. And it gave us these great views of the Earth. And gave a boost to car culture. And we had the first fender bender on the moon too, where you can see a improvised repair of a damaged fender where I think this was his receipt logbook or something, was clamped onto the fender, which somehow got smashed. Anyway, the Apollo program was not the only thing that was happening in the late 60s. That I was into. The other thing, another thing, was this album that came out in 1968, Switched on Bach, which I have. And, you know, besides Bach being pretty good music, I was totally amazed by this machine. I just thought, besides making great sounds, being a really cool idea, that it looked really neat. And so, you know, Robert Moog had invented this synthesizer, and Walter Carlos, he was Walter Carlos back then, now this cover says Wendy Carlos, it's been redone. But Walter Carlos really popularized the Moog synthesizer with this album. This did amazing work to let everybody know about the Moog synthesizer. The other person who was sort of promoting the Moog was Keith Emerson, via this band, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which was completely bombastic and over the top, but just, perfect for the young people that they were. And they were totally ripping off classical music and putting it into a rock idiom. And I loved the sound of the featured machine, which you can see here, a modular Moog synthesizer, which was largely a stage prop for him. Anyway, these are the albums that came out in the late 60s, or 1970 or so, 1971. And you can see pictures at an exhibition where they just took Mussorgsky and updated it with contemporary music machines, and did some Tchaikovsky on this album too. So this was just a machine that really caught my attention, one for how it worked, but two for what it looked like. I just thought it was beautiful. This is an ARP, another competing designer who thought patch cords were too messy, and he came up with these switch matrices that eliminated patch cords, but I actually prefer the patch cord look. I gave you some curves. Yeah, you can see all the knobs without patch cords. That is Dr. Robert Moog with the actual machine that Keith Emerson used all the time. This is a more recent picture. And these things spread to universities. This is actual, this is State University at Albany, a music studio at a university. This is the EMU brand. This is a letter that actually I got back from Moog Music in 1972. So I was 12 years old. I had sent a letter asking for information about their machines, and I got this price list back and found out what I wanted cost $6,390 in 1972 dollars, and I was 12 years old. So that is where I got the idea that I should study electronics, try to figure out how to make one of my own. And so then I set out to do that. Didn't realize it would take so long. But my dad was always asking my mom, what is this synthesizer that he keeps talking about? And she would say, oh, it's just like an organ. So this got me to thinking about pipe organs, which I really didn't know anything about. It's kind of interesting that here's machinery that's been made for 300 years continuously. People don't think much of it of being machinery, but which is interesting to me. As why is it that certain machinery alienates people and other machinery does not? But you can see, for 300 years, people keep on building these. Here's a more contemporary one, and here's really one of the most recent, this being the one at the Disney Music Hall in LA, in the Geary building. The organist is in that little, that's the bench. So here's the where the organist could fit. Again, I thought these were beautiful machines, and they have hundreds of years of history. Just like this machine, which had a beginning. I mean, there was Cristofori, who actually had to invent the piano. It's not something that has always existed, and it's evolved slowly, but improved, or at least, changed in ways that people wanted it to change. And so, because of the synthesizer, I was always interested in how it is that certain musical instruments seemed less machine-like, simply by being old, I suppose, and not knowing who the original inventor was. And certain ones seemed more modern. In the 60s, a lot of musicians were taking a lot of electronic equipment and creating new music with all that equipment. And I can see from these are scans of album covers. Obviously, they had an appreciation of the machinery. They liked the machinery. They wouldn't pose with it like this if they didn't like the machinery. So there's a certain machine fetishism. You know, the group portrait with all the machinery. This is a violin exposed as to all the parts that are in it. Kind of makes it seem less sacred. But, you know, there's all these publicity shots with musicians. Always feature them. You know, this guy's toting this is Coltrane, but he's carrying a machine along with him. But nobody thinks anything of it. It's just, that's normal. Every publicity shot you see is with this machine. Same deal in the classical world. It'd be fun to pose these people with the wrong instrument. Just not quite a publicity shot here, but. You know, the entire orchestra poses with each person holding his instrument. So it's not just a shot of the people, it's with their machines. Oops. Hendrix, who really did a great job with electronics, and I'm glad to see, well, actually, I thought this was funny. You can buy a figurine of Jimi Hendrix out of genuine plastic, I'm sure. But fortunately, this figurine includes the amplifier and all the pedals, which I thought was very important because, you know, what Hendrix knew for sure is that he wasn't playing just the guitar, he was playing this whole electronic system. And Zappa was just you know, besides being a brilliant composer, was a master of the recording room and had his own portable recording truck, recorded all his concerts. So I was looking at other people who were fusing with the machine. And this is one image I think is so romantic, that Otto Lilienthal, trying to fly before the Wright brothers. He actually flew a lot, but a bad landing was the end of him in 1898. But, you know, his idea was sound, and he just didn't have ripstop nylon and aluminum and all the fancy materials we have now. But this is a way of, you know, fusing with the machine again. People on a very individual, one-on-one basis, connecting. So I've always been interested in subcultures where people do this, where they kind of just wear the machine, you know, like a musical instrument, where, you know, man and machine together. And I even thought that this car business is really about dressing up. It's not about transportation because they're not going anywhere. So maybe it's just a way that guys can dress up because, you know, every other animal, the male's really more flamboyant. So why shouldn't that be true for humans too? And they like to dress up and go dancing. And then later, this is something that I didn't see as a kid. I only got into this recently when a friend took me to the drag races in California. Besides being amazingly loud, it's interesting to see these sculptures because they're handmade. You know, they're one of a kind. things that some guy has put together. They really know how to use tools. So it seemed like, a great place to see sculpture. What I think of as sculpture, of being handmade, one-of-a-kind objects. And there is one of these dragsters in a museum, in fact, at the Smithsonian. And here's the the label listing all the materials, so many materials. But although I didn't look at dragsters as a kid, there was this thing happening in the 60s, this Craig Breedlove, this crazy guy setting all the land speed records, which I remember as a kid, out on the Bonneville salt flats with these jet-powered cars breaking 300, 400, 500, 600 miles per hour in the 60s. I think in 65 was 600 miles per hour in cars like that, which are pretty neat looking. And I really like that. And also in the 60s was this thing, this X-15 plane that's dropped from a B-52, and then the X-15, I don't think anything's beaten the speed record since then. This was done in the 60s, about 4,500 miles per hour. And I made a model of this. I remember a plastic kit of the X-15, which I thought was very interesting because it didn't have rear wheels, just landed on skids. And incidentally, I just learned that one of the test pilots of the X-15 was Neil Armstrong, who was that guy who landed on the moon. And so this is what he was doing before that. This is one of Craig Breedlove's more recent machines. He called every one of his cars Spirit of America, so it's kind of hard to know which one's which. But there it is. I think he was trying to break the sound barrier. And this is the vehicle that actually did break the sound barrier on land. Again, a one-of-a-kind, hand-built, useless machine. There you can see the shock waves going off it when it's supersonic. All right, so these were the kind of sculptures that I saw everywhere in the 60s. I thought it was, there was art everywhere. And so now let me show some video of the things I made. Let's see, other sculptures. All right. So this is terrible video because this is an old piece. But this is from 1986. A piece called Voyeur, almost 20 years old. One of the very earliest digital video pieces that I made. So I wanted the movement of video, which is what the eyeballs are, they're video images, but there's no external video apparatus. It's all self-contained digital circuits. And here's another example of doing that with this piece called Waiting, where that box is about this big with the clock only a second hand and my hand drumming away. The thing was to get away from any kind of narrative and have motion, have a body part. The digital image saved me the trouble of having to draw it because I can't draw. But to have a self-contained object with no external apparatus connected to it. This 1994, family. It has mouths in video on 12-inch screens. So each screen's like that. Then it has these throbbing speakers. There's an example of a sculpture like that in the gallery. This piece combines both of those things. And it's this whole thing is tied together with ropes and chains and handcuffs. And don't ask me to explain. This thing, Quartet, shows you sort of the difference of having digital video in terms of the choreography. You can tell that it's not just multi-channel, it's completely digital. So that's my hand, but it's also choreographed by one central program that's able to synchronize these motions. This would be related to a piece in the gallery that's called Transportable Device. This one's just called Throbber, and it employs a speaker that's not used to make any sound. The speaker is just used as a kinetic element to move this giant ball around. So in all of the pieces that I've done with speakers, the speakers are just kinetic devices. They're not sound devices. This is a more recent digital video piece using LCD flat screens instead of CRTs. The CRTs are, the television picture tubes, and the LCDs are the nice flat, thin screens like we have on laptops. But again, all the imagery is digitally stored, and it's not playing a recording, it's generating this animation on the fly according to a program which simulates the motion of eyeballs. So there's actually a computer in there creating these motions. And so here's one which has 6 channels of video. Now, this would be completely impractical to do with a stack of video players of any kind, whether they were computers or videotape players, DVD players, whatever. I mean, the electronics that's making that happen is just there, that little box in the corner of the cage. That's what does it all. So it allows me to have the sculptural object that I want to have, which is this cage. And it is an object that all you need to do is plug it in. This is another multi-eye piece called Iris. And I did a lot of things which sort of fused machine with animal. And I thought this was more plant with machine, but then the eyeballs are animal, so it's kind of throwing all three together. The eyeball is the animal part, the stalks are the plant part, the electronics is the machine part. And these eyes actually change colors on every day. I can tell that video was taken on a Friday because the screens are different colors, which is something which just would happen on Fridays. So the pieces function as calendars also. And this piece also is made out of a lot of different materials, including rubber. This is really old, which is why the video is so bad. But it's a very early kinetic piece related to the robots that are in the gallery, using a CRT for the image device with my hand on it. And it has all self-contained electronics and computers for coordinating the motion and the hand and all that. But it was pretty crude, 1988, pretty simple. But this is one of the earliest pieces that had my, where I tried to build a motion system and the computers for controlling a motion system. This is later, 94, where the image device is a 1-inch CRT. So that's really, that eyeball is just 1 inch diagonally across. That used to be what they used for viewfinders on video cameras. And it's on this mechanical armature which moves it about. And this piece responds to light, so that the more light there is, the more active it is. And in the evening, it becomes more lethargic till in the dark, it just closes its eye and sleeps through the night. This was a sort of updated, more recent version of that, which is, this piece in total is about this tall, 2 feet tall or so, and has some smoother mechanical action to it. You can't really see it here, but all of the pieces now have these motion sensors that I use, so I never have to turn the pieces on and off, but they would just sleep when nobody's around and activate when they have an audience. I do all the mechanical part, and you can see from this video that I kind of get into all the little screws and tiny parts that it takes to get this working. This is a Running Man earlier than the Running Man that is in the gallery. This is one using a CRT, and the Running Man's composed of just little dots. I kind of think of this as the Heisenberg Man. Just a collection of dots make up the figure, and through the motion it's easier to read than any single still would be, because there's not much information there, but you put it all together in motion, you get that very clear figure running. And it's in a acrylic jar. Case is all just fabricated from some acrylic tubing and acrylic plates. And then this is a pair of running men. Where they're running, well, I should say actually the wheel speed is synchronized with the distance of their stride, so that they're turning the wheel. Which, I mean, fortunately, since it's all digital, you have the control of the speed of the runners and of the wheel. This was really one of the first robotic pieces, which I started in '93 and finished in '95. These two elements interact with each other. Each arm is 5 feet long. But this is, I think, the first piece where I have two parts. And on this piece, there's a overall choreography of the two elements sort of exploring the space and discovering each other and coming together, first somewhat timid and then a little more playful. And this is the piece that convinced me that I had to learn about being a machinist, because I built this piece without a mill or a lathe, and it really showed me that I needed to get a mill and a lathe, which I did get after this piece. So everything else has been built using the mill and the lathe after this. This one is in the gallery, so I don't know if everybody's had a chance to see it, but this is Pair, which again uses two elements, but in this case the two elements are quite different, whereas in robot dance they're identical units. Here there's two very different elements interacting with each other, and you might see that the tripod aspect ratio is kind of different on the documentation. that this piece will look different the way it is set up now in the gallery. This piece has traveled, and it's an interesting problem of the design of how these things might be pulled apart and go into boxes and travel. This is one, again, with two elements, but these elements are pretty large. When they're stretched out, the tall one's 13 feet tall. This is somewhat similar to the California landscape, which is in the gallery, but this piece has two elements on 40 feet of track. So the two elements are interacting with each other as they roll back and forth on the track. And these pieces actually make sound, but I don't have that in any of the recordings of this piece, or any of these pieces. The mechanical pieces all make sound, so you have to go by the gallery to hear what the sounds are. And again, this is similar to the robot dance in the way that they explored the space together. All right, I wanted to use the time now to, we can kill this, that's my desktop. Let me see, I might be able to do that. Okay, so I wanted to have some time for questions that you might have now that you've seen all this stuff. So please, yeah, with some lights, maybe I can see, raise hands and we'll do some questions. And all the way in the back there.
How long did it take you to make all the robots?
Well, this has been going on for almost 20 years. So that's a long time. Plus, you know, it took, 20 years to learn to get to that point to start making them. So it's been a very slow process. And yeah, can you believe? Yeah, can you believe I'm that old? An unimaginable length of time. Yeah. But it was fun, so I really don't, you know, it was a good way to spend all that time. Yeah? Over there.
Could you kind of do a synopsis of the process you learned in terms of where did you learn to work in video, where did you learn to work in robotics, what kind of training or what kind of schooling did you do?
The synopsis of my training in these various domains. My formal education was an electrical engineering degree, and that's only 4 years of learning some basics about circuits. I did that at MIT, which is a very science-oriented approach to it, rather than, I mean, it's a very mathematical approach, very general. It's not very specific, but that was really my only formal training, and so I didn't ever learn anything specifically about video or about mechanical engineering or any of that stuff. I don't know, the video, I just, I knew that computers could draw pictures, so I knew it was possible, and I was just trying to reduce it to the smallest possible circuit for doing that. And the machinist stuff, I bought a mill and a lathe and damaged a lot of bits trying to figure out how to do that. And I've just done it through experimentation. And the mechanical engineering part was, I don't know, it's just kind of, I limit myself to things that aren't that complicated. I mean, that's because I really don't know that much about it. So, yeah. Sorry, I didn't study much of any of those things. Yes.
I'm interested in the fact that a lot of the things that people cover up most that you find beautiful, the chords and the access and talking about the materials that you spoke today, and Lenny's talked about, you have a real appreciation for. I'm just interested at what point in your career this came to you as an artistic endeavor. Has it always been that way? Has it always been your intention? Was it that it was art?
Was it always my intention to do this stuff as art? Yeah, well, I think, yeah, it was. I always thought this machinery was beautiful. I mean, I thought the Moog synthesizer was quite beautiful, and I thought it was a pity that they put bodies on cars, you know, because all the interesting stuff is under the hood, and the coverings always seemed false on everything, and what was inside is really what made it work, and that was what was attractive to me. And I thought, you know, things like the lunar lander, you know, no stylist ever got to it, so it had a certain purity that was quite precious and quite beautiful. So, yeah, it always intrigued me, and the electrical engineering school, that was art school for me. I mean, I needed to know that stuff. That was how to do it. Yeah. And you?
So then, are your definitions, when you were talking about some certain objects as sculpture, you were referring to like unique machines. So is your definition of art something that is like a personally built unique object?
The personally built unique object part. Is that important to me? Yeah, I do like this thing about personally built, and I obsess over that. I actually do all the building of my work, and that's why I like the dragsters, the guys who built them themselves. Whereas the art world, I know, has gone largely to this, you know, specialization where there's an artist who thinks about things, but there's other people who build them, and I don't know. To me, building it's fun, and building it informs what your next thing will be. I mean, when the designer and builder are separate, there's not any feedback loop. But when the designer and builder are the same person, then everything you build informs the next thing that you will design. And so that's very important to me, to actually build the stuff myself. But I mean, obviously, in the art world, it's accepted practice that you need not build anything at all. So, two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So, people who really need something answered, you know, you gotta. Yeah, okay, you look urgent.
There seem to be two notions of beauty at play here. One is the physiognomical beauty of all these, and the other one is the beauty of the logic that plays into them. Through them. At the same time, there seem to be two notions of representation at play. One based on resemblance, and the other one based on some sort of covariance, if you want. How do you relate to those two dichotomies?
I can't quite paraphrase that question, but I'd like you to write my next essay, because I appreciate what you are saying about these qualities of beauty, and if you can ever get more than one quality of beauty into a piece, I mean, that's just fine with me. But Yeah, I mean, I would say there are these multiple things that I'm going after in terms of, one is a resemblance, which is, reminds you of something but doesn't completely copy it, and one is a kind of dissonance between seeing a behavior but seeing, you know, what's a animal or human behavior done by a machine. So maybe that's what you're talking about, but I don't know. Is that related? Because I am very much intrigued by those ideas, and I think they're, I mean, to me they're attractive. I like watching that. And so final, yes, up there.
How long did it take you to make the running man in the gallery?
The running man in the gallery, how long? Well, that series started in around, what, 2002 or something? That piece is maybe 2004. I don't even remember the exact dates, but I'll tell you what the process is like, that no single piece is built from beginning to end in isolation, but there is this whole kit of parts. And so years before I get to a piece, I'm building the kit. So I know that I'll need this video generator part, and I know that I'll need the software that runs that, and I know that I'll need the power supply part, and I know that I'll need, you know, there's all these different little units, and I spend my time building up my kit of parts. Then I have a kit of parts that I can assemble the piece from. So it's not like I go in to the studio and from scratch build a piece from start to end. It's a two-stage process of building the kit and then putting the kit together, building a piece. So anyway, thank you for all your questions and for coming tonight.